Now we're to the fun part and we get to sew. We're going to start with our lining pieces. And the first thing we're going to do is give ourselves a little guide seam or marking seam here. We're going to sew 1/2 inch from our bottom edge. Make sure you are carefully identifying which is your top and bottom. Maybe your print is non-directional and it wouldn't matter, but if it is directional, make sure you know which one is your bottom. All right, no need to backstitch or anything on that particular seam. We're just using this as to help us know where we're cutting and where we're sewing in the future. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take our ruler. We're going to measure over. This ruler is 6.5 inches exactly, and that's what I'm going to want to measure for my small baskets. For my large basket, it's 8 1/4. I'm going to measure over and I'm going to mark. I'm going to do the same on the other one. Now on all 4 of these marks that I've just made, and I just used a regular pencil. If you're concerned about it, you can use an invisible pen, whatever you want. It's not going to show, so it doesn't really matter. And I'm going to clip to my seam, but not through my seam on all 4 of these. Okay, now that I've finished that, I'm going to take both of my lining pieces and I'm going to put them together, right sides together, and I'm going to sew the sides. Now, when we're doing this, sewing on this, almost all of your seam allowances are going to be 1/2 inch. The only time we're not going to be using a 1/2 inch seam allowance is when we're sewing our handles. We're going to use a little bit of a smaller seam allowance on those. So just get ready to use that 1/2 inch. And I'm just putting in a few pins here. Now I'm going to sew. So I've got my bottoms lined up. So I've got both bottom pieces on the bottom where my stitching is. I've got my sides lined up and I'm going to sew each side, 1/2 inch seam. I am going to backstitch at the top and bottom of these. All right, so all right, so there we have completed our top stitching. I'm just going to trim my threads. All right, our next step is pinning our bottom to the lining, the sides. So I'm just going to turn this wrong side out, and what we're going to do, anywhere where we've made a notch is where we're going to have a corner. So I'm going to take my bottom, I'm going to take a corner, I'm going to make a 90-degree angle with this cut, and I'm going to match it up with my corner. And I'm just going to pin this in place. You're going to maybe get a little fold in your corner where it makes this point. That's not such a big deal. Don't worry too much about that. We're going to do the same thing for all 4 corners. I'm not going to worry about pinning in between my corners just yet, but I'm going to make a 90-degree angle and I'm going to line that up. And then once I have all my corners pinned like this, I'm going to go in and pin between the corners. That way I know I've made sure I've lined everything up nicely. Looks like I missed a thread here. And if you have one that's a little bit harder to match, it feels like there might be a little bit of extra there, that's where we want to ease in any of that extra stuff. Once we've got our corners lined up, we're okay to make this fit in between. And it really should fit together nicely. If your seam allowance is off at all, you might have just a little bit that you have to work in there. And I don't like to pin. I really don't like to pin. But this is one of those scenarios where pinning is really important. So make sure you do a thorough job with your pins. This is our last side. Now, we made, in the beginning, you'll remember we made our 1/2 inch seam that we put from the bottom of our lining. We're going to use that in this step. We are going to use it to help us to, that's what we're going to use to sew on again. You can also use your guide on your sewing machine, but I really like to make sure that I've got lots of things to help me follow to make sure I do a really great job. So now I've got it all pinned. We're going to sew this, but rather than sewing, dropping our needle and pivoting, all you're going to do is take this to your machine and you're going to sew 4 separate seams. One on this side, one on this side, one on this side, and one on the other side. And I like to backstitch at each corner just to give the seam extra strength, make sure it's not going to pull out. And the reason why I do it this way is because I find when I try to pivot my corners that I have a really hard time getting a nice square finish in the end. So I like to start at the beginning of each side and sew them each independently. And I'm just following my previous stitching. I want to make sure that that stitching is hidden. So if I'm gonna err on any side of that stitching, I want to err on the inside of it, not on the outside, because I don't want it to show in my bottom. Ooh, I put on some speed there. All right, and I'm gonna backstitch here. So I've done one side. Now I'm gonna take it completely out of my machine. I'm gonna turn it and I'm gonna do the next side. All right, finished all 4 sides. The last thing we need to do to prep our lining is just go back to these corners, clip our threads, and we're just going to cut out that corner so that when we turn it right side out, it fits really nicely together. Make sure when you're clipping these corners that you don't cut through any of the seams that you've made. All right, you still want to hit it with your iron though, and then we're all done with our lining.